If Genesis is the book of beginnings, Exodus is a book of redemption. Yeah, a lot of us think of the movie The Ten Commandments. And, the folks that did that movie, they did a reasonably good job. There are some obvious issues if you're looking for a pure representation of the book of Exodus. I have a real hard time believing that anyone traveling with the Jewish Exodus had a New York accent. Come on. But yeah, the story itself is reasonably close with some obvious issues. The word Exodus simply means the outgoing or going out. It represents the movement of the Israelites from the land of Egypt. Now, as with the book of Genesis, because Exodus is also part of the Pentateuch, you remember that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, tradition and statements by Jesus and some of the apostles in the New Testament attribute the book of Exodus and all 5 books of the Pentateuch to Moses. We have no hard, fast evidence. If you really want to go digging in archaeological sense to get firm proof, you're not going to find it. But if you trust the New Testament and you trust the traditions that have been handed down for thousands of years, then Moses wrote the book of Exodus. I believe it to be a book of redemption, a book of reclamation. It tells the story of how God delivered the Israelites from their bondage under Pharaoh in Egypt and then established them as his chosen nation. Now, you might wonder, how did Israel end up in slavery in the first place? Because God made this covenant with Abraham, and how is it that the descendants of Abraham who are chosen by God end up in slavery? Well, at the end of Genesis, you may recall, chapter 46, Jacob, who was also known as Israel, traveled with his family to Egypt because there was a famine throughout the region. And by that time, his long-lost son Joseph had been made second in command under Pharaoh, because Joseph had shown himself to be a man of great intelligence, more importantly, a man who operated under God's favor. And he told Pharaoh, because of the dream that God gave to Pharaoh, that there would be 7 years of an abundance of crops and then 7 years of famine. And it was during the 7 years of famine that Jacob brought his other 11 sons and their wives and all of their children and came to Egypt. Genesis 46:26 tells us all those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. With the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, the members of Jacob's family, which went to Egypt, were 70 in all. Now, when they arrived, Genesis 47 tells us that Pharaoh showed them great kindness and favor because of his feelings for Joseph. And if they were Joseph's family, Pharaoh wanted to make sure they had the best of everything. And so he gave them an area of Egypt, a region called Goshen. And he told them they could have that for their family. And it was some of the most fertile and abundant land in the whole kingdom. And Pharaoh gave it to Joseph's family. And so they all moved there and set up. And then as we move into Exodus chapter 1, beginning with verse 6, we find out how things change. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increasing in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithon and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Now, in Exodus 1:14, as you read it, it seems to pass very quickly. But there are, in fact, roughly 400 years contained in Exodus 1:14. As the situation moved from the days of Joseph to a day when Joseph was no longer even remembered, and the new Pharaoh placed the Hebrews under slavery. He made them slaves because they were afraid of this great number of people. And this had actually been prophesied by God himself when he told Abram in Genesis 15 that he was going to make him a great nation and all of that would come to pass, but that this nation would be put under oppression. He said, I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. He said, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. And so God told him this was going to happen because he is getting things ready. In fact, in Genesis 15, he says that the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So we have roughly 400 years. Exodus 12:40 tells us it was actually 430 years from the days when the Hebrews were slaves until Moses was born, and then roughly 30 years thereafter when the Exodus took place. We believe Moses was about 30 years old when it all started. Now, again, as I keep telling you, all of this information is in the PDF, so don't get too worried about getting everything written down and all of that. But the book of Exodus breaks down into a couple of sections. The first section runs from chapters 1 through chapter 31, and it has to do mainly with Moses and his dealings with Pharaoh, and then the Exodus as it gets underway, and this huge number of Israelite people head out. Now, what do we know about Moses? Well, we learn a great deal about Moses in Exodus chapter 2. We learn that Moses was born to a man of the tribe of Levi. So Moses was also a Levite. He came from that particular tribe. However, by this time, Pharaoh was making the Egyptian midwives kill all of the children, all of the male children that were born, to keep the Israelites from continuing to increase in number. However, Moses' mother hid him. She managed to hide him, it says in Exodus chapter 2, for about 3 months. And anyone who has ever tried to keep a baby quiet knows that is pretty much an impossible task 24 hours a day. And so she had a problem. So thinking it would be better than allowing him to simply be executed, she placed Moses into the hand of God, and then literally she placed him into a papyrus basket and set him afloat in the Nile River. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter, And that's how Moses came to be in the house of Pharaoh. And because Pharaoh's daughter found him, she raised him as her own. In an interesting twist, when Moses was found and that basket was taken up out of the water, Moses' sister Miriam was following from a distance to see what would happen. And when she saw that, she seized the opportunity, jumped out, and said, would you like me to get you someone to take care of the baby, a nanny, if you will? And that seemed like a good idea to Pharaoh's daughter. And so Miriam went and got her mother. So Moses was, at least when he was a very small child, raised by his own mother, even though he has been adopted into the house of Pharaoh. And that's how all of this got started. Now understand, though, what's happening. When Moses is taken into the house of Pharaoh, he gets all the best. He gets good nutrition. He gets a first-class education. He is trained in military strategy. All of those things because he was adopted into the house of Pharaoh. But then in verse 11 of chapter 2, we find out that after Moses had grown up, he was out surveying the work that the Hebrew slaves were carrying out. And as he watched them, he saw an Egyptian slave master beating one of the slaves. And he looked around to make sure no one was watching, and he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. Now, as always happens, things have a way of getting out, and it came out that this Egyptian had been killed, and people knew Moses had done it. And in verse 15 of chapter 2, we read Pharaoh, when he heard of this, tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. Moses was probably in the region called Midian for about 30 years. While he was there, he married a woman, a Hebrew woman named Zipporah, and they had a son. And meanwhile, during this time, this roughly 30-year period, Pharaoh died. And then we come to one of the more famous sections of Exodus, chapter 3, when Moses is tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, and he looks and he sees this bush, and it's on fire, which was not that exceptional. But the exceptional thing was it was not being consumed by the fire. Curiosity got the best of him, and he went to see this thing. And when he did, as he approached, God spoke to him from within that fire. And he said to him, "Don't come any closer until you remove your sandals, for you are coming onto holy ground." And then he identified himself as the God of Moses' father, as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. You're going to hear God referred to many times in the Old Testament as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The Jewish people consider them to be their kind of Mount Rushmore, those three patriarchs, those three that all Jewish people can trace their lineage through. I mean, maybe not now, thousands of years later, but the Jewish people look to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their beginning and as where they all come from. Now, when Moses heard the voice of God, he hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And it was then that God revealed the plan. He wanted to free Moses' people, the Hebrew people, from Egyptian slavery. And that all sounded like a great idea. I'm sure Moses agreed with him, right up until the point where God told him, "I want you to do it." How would you respond? There is this thing It really needs to be done. There's a whole nation of people who are being oppressed. Slavery is wrong. Everybody knows that. We want to set them free. Yay, we're all in favor of it. And then God says, I want you to do it. In Exodus 3 and Exodus 4, Moses actually gives God 5 excuses, 5 questions he asks. First, he said to them, who am I? You know, I'm this nobody, Lord. I'm exiled from Egypt. I had to run for my life. I can't go back there. They're going to kill me. I'm a nobody. And God answered that excuse with this phrase, I will be with you. In fact, as a sign to you of my faithfulness, you will come and worship me on this mountain after successfully completing this assignment. He told him that. He said, I will be with you, and this will be my sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. That's excuse number 1, and God answered it. Excuse number 2, suppose I go to the Israelites and I tell them you sent me. They're going to ask me what your name is, which, you know, that there's always a theologian around that says, well, if God is speaking through you, who is God? And God told him, I am who I am. That is what you say to the Israelites. I love that answer. So that's excuse number 2, and God answered it. Then Moses answered, but what if they don't believe me? What if they say God didn't appear to you? And the Lord took him through a series of miracles. He says to him, what's in your hand? Moses says a staff. He's holding a staff. Remember, Moses was a shepherd, so he's holding a staff. The Lord says, throw it on the ground. And when he threw it on the ground, it turned into a snake. Must have been a good-sized snake because the staff Moses was carrying was probably at least 5 feet long. And he turned it into a snake. And that might have gotten Moses' attention, but then God says, reach out and take hold of it by the tail, which I'm no expert, but it appears to me that grabbing a snake by the tail is the worst way to grab one, but that's what God said to do, and Moses did it. So even though he's making excuses and he has doubts, he had a reasonable amount of faith, so let's give Moses credit where credit's due. That was his third excuse. And then God said, put your hand inside your coat and then take it out. And when he did, his hand had gone leprous. And then he said, put it back. And when he put it back, it came out again and it was clean. And so Moses did as God told him to. And God said, listen, if they don't believe you, do these 2 things. Do your staff into a snake trick and do the leprosy thing. And if they still don't believe that, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground and it will turn into blood. Remember that. That's kind of a foreshadowing that God does. But then, see, that's excuse 3, and God answered it. Then Moses said, but Lord, I don't speak well. To put it the way the scripture reads, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Some scholars think Moses stuttered. And the Lord responds back to him, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes people deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? I do. And so that's 4 excuses that Moses gave why he shouldn't be chosen for this mission. And God answered every one of them. There's a lesson there. He will answer our doubts. When he asks us to do something that is difficult, he will answer our doubts. You can go to the Lord with your questions. Just because you have questions does not mean you've lost faith. It just means you have some concerns. You're human. And that's what Moses did 4 different times. And when you read the passage, if you haven't done it already, you will notice God seems extremely patient. But then Moses says this, Exodus 4, verse 17. But Moses said, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. And then the scripture says the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Okay, God's done playing at that time. Moses' fifth excuse was actually not so much an excuse as it was a refusal. And I'm not sure how God expressed his anger to Moses, how he made that known to him, but I'm of the opinion that it was pretty impressive and completely intimidating, because whatever God did, it put Moses in line, and he set out for Egypt. And of course, when he gets to Egypt, he marches into Pharaoh's chambers in Exodus chapter 5, and he says this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. And of course, Pharaoh kind of laughed. He said, who are you? Who is God compared to me? I'm Pharaoh. And in the Egyptian belief system, in their worldview, Pharaoh was a god. They believed in multiple gods, and Pharaoh was one of them, and the pharaohs believed that of themselves. And so I'm not letting these people go. That's not going to happen. He refused, and in fact, it ticked him off, and he increased the Hebrews' workload, made it harder for them. And so they actually kind of turned on Moses and Aaron, who he had taken with him to Egypt. They had kind of turned on them, and Moses has got a problem. But God kind of soothes that over long enough for the plagues to start. Now, I believe there are two reasons for the plagues over Egypt. Number one, God is showing his people, his chosen people, that he is molding into a nation who he is and how powerful he is and how he will get things done. He wants the Hebrews to have faith in him. And by the way, I keep saying Hebrews. Jewish people and Hebrew people, that's the same thing. Hebrews is a more ancient description of the nation. Nowadays, we call them Jewish or Israelites, but Hebrews works as well. You probably already knew that, but just in case you didn't. So we have these 10 plagues that kick off in Exodus chapter 7. We're not going to go into a lot of detail of them. You're familiar with them. We go back to that movie, The 10 Commandments. They did a pretty good job for the day in which that movie was made. But the first plague was the Nile, and all the water in Egypt was turned into blood. That's Exodus 7:14 through 24. And then the next few plagues are in Exodus 8. From the water turning into blood, we have the plague of frogs. And then we have the plague of gnats. And then we have the plague of flies. And then we have the death of the livestock. Then we get boils, we get hail, we get locusts, we get darkness. That's the first 9. Now, the first 9 plagues go together. If you turn all the water into blood, that water is no longer suitable for the fish and the animals, the amphibians and all those things that live in that water. Where do you think the frogs are going to go? They're going to head for land. And so when the Nile turned to blood, the frogs vacated, came ashore, and then I believe God probably sent more of the frogs. I mean, when we're talking a plague of frogs, we're not talking about a couple of frogs in the backyard. We're talking of an infestation. Everywhere you look, in the cupboards, in your bed, in your bathroom, everywhere you go, frogs. And if you have frogs, the gnats tend to come around. They kind of seem to go together because that's what the frogs eat, and the gnats were next. And when you have gnats, what do you get next? You get flies. And if you get lots of flies, you have disease. And when you have disease, it often affects the livestock. And when you have livestock that's infected and this disease is beginning to spread, then you have boils. So there is a very logical feasible progression from one plague to the next, that does not diminish the miraculous nature of the plagues. That's just God using his creation. And then you have the hail. I have no connection for the hail. I think at this point, God is just saying, okay, fine, I've had enough. And so we have hail and lightning and thunder and wind, and it was a storm unlike anything the Egyptians had ever seen. And then the locusts moved in. And then there was darkness. Now, I believe when the Bible talks about darkness, it's talking about that kind of darkness that's so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face, and you can feel it. And then from there, we move to the final plague. Now, contrary to what the movie The Ten Commandments indicated, Yul Brynner playing the Pharaoh, he did not choose that plague. This death of the firstborn was totally within God's will and in his hand, and this was a plague that God instituted. And all of the children, all of the adults, all of the firstborn would fall under this curse, except, let's see how your Sunday school knowledge is. Who is exempt from the plague of the death of the firstborn? Those who put the blood of the lamb on the door. Now, this is the identifier that God gave them. Yeah, that's correct, Tracy. This is the identifier that God gave Moses, and he passed this on as instructions to the Israelites. And he said, listen, go home and take a lamb, slaughter the lamb, and put the blood on the outside of your door frame. Spread it around there. And when the death angel comes, it will pass over your home, and all of you will be spared, including the firstborn in that household. Okay? So that was done. And in fact, that is why the Jewish people have Passover. The Passover feast is intended to commemorate this night that we're talking about now. The Passover feast is what Jesus and his disciples, his apostles, were celebrating on the night when he instituted the Lord's Supper. So this night in Egypt, when the death angel passed over all of the homes that had the blood of the lamb on the door, the thread of that still carries through even to today in our celebration of communion. Now, during that night, Pharaoh called Moses in. He's had enough. He said, get out, get all your people, gather them up, and get out of here before the whole nation is wiped out. And so while the Israelites are packing up, they did as Moses instructed, and they asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and clothing and food. And Exodus 12:36 says, the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them whatever they asked for, so that they plundered the Egyptians. So not only did God get the Israelites out of Egypt, he loaded them up with the wealth that they would need to move to this new area, this promised land that he's going to take them to, and he set them up. He is putting everything in place that the Israelites need to become this chosen nation. Now, the leavened bread thing was not part of the Passover until that night when the Israelites were gathering up to leave, because they scooped up their yeast, their dough, and it was before the yeast had been added, and they threw it in bags and boxes and troughs, and they carried it off, and they had not put the leaven in. And so that unleavened bread became part of their Passover observance the following year and the following year, all the way through to today. That's why the unleavened bread is part of the Passover. Now they head out, and I'm moving fast because we're running low on time. When they came to the Red Sea, God parted the Red Sea and let them cross on dry land. You know that part. But by this time, the Egyptians, Pharaoh's changed his mind, and the whole Egyptian army is heading out to recapture all of these slaves. And God took the Israelites across the Red Sea, and then when the Egyptians tried to pursue, he closed it up, and he destroyed the Egyptian army in one fell swoop. Now, also along the path after the Red Sea incident, God provided water. That's Exodus 15. And he provided food in the form of manna and quail. That's Exodus 16. He also protected them from the Amalekites, and the nation of Israel, still being formed, won its first military victory under the hand of God. Now, just an interesting bit of trivia, that word manna, which the Bible describes as almost crystallized bread-like substance that came down from the sky and then dried up, and the Israelites would collect it up and they would eat it. It was provided as food for them from God. The word manna literally means, what is it? And so I see a great deal of humor. I can see these Hebrews walking around. They're picking this stuff up and putting it in containers, and they're eating it. And it tasted good. And they're going, oh, this is good. What is it? And I don't know, but it's good. And so I find that humorous. But that's what the word manna means. Then we find the Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai. You know what happens there. Moses goes up on the mountain. He has this conversation with God in which God laid out the commandments and the covenant. There's a lot more to this agreement between God and the nation of Israel than just the 10 Commandments, but we'll get to that. And if you've done your reading, you've already gotten to it. We get the 10 Commandments. They're recorded in two different places in the Old Testament, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And as you look down through the 10 Commandments, I'm not going to read them all to you because you're familiar with them, but I encourage you, if you have not done so already, to go back and read them again in Exodus chapter 20 and look at them in terms of their logical, common sense approach to setting up a culture. You see, God is establishing Israel not only as a nation, but as a culture and as a religious system. He's going to give them everything they need to succeed when they set up in the Promised Land. And so the 10 Commandments make perfect sense. And they are, in fact, the foundation of nearly every moral and ethical system in the world. They're woven into that. We understand that murder is wrong because the 10 Commandments taught us that. We understand that we're not supposed to lie because the commandments teach us that. All of that stuff is contained in those commandments, and they are recorded in Exodus 20, verses 1 through, I believe it's 20. You read Exodus chapter 20, and you will get the 10 Commandments. Now, in addition to the commandments, God gave Moses the laws and regulations that are going to set up the civic and religious systems for the Israelite nation going forward. That's in Exodus 21, 22, and 23. And in Exodus 24 through 31, he also gives them instructions for this beautiful tabernacle. Now, granted, it was a tent, but it must have been amazing. He also gave them instructions for the Ark of the Covenant, all of the furnishings for the tabernacle, and the priesthood. And all of those instructions are contained in Exodus 24 through 31. And everything is going great until the Israelites became impatient. I draw your attention to Exodus 32, chapter 1. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, the Israelites became impatient. And the text reads as follows. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." They lost faith. They became impatient. They gathered all their gold, and Moses' own brother Aaron made it into an idol in the shape of a calf, and they worshiped it, and they celebrated, and they partied, and they carried on. And in Exodus 32:35, we find Moses is so angry that he destroys the Ten Commandments. He smashes the tablets. But that's mild compared to God. In Exodus 32, we read that God was so angry with the Israelites that he told Moses, fine, I'm going to destroy all of them, and I will fulfill my covenant with Abraham through you and your family. And God pleaded, or Moses pleaded on behalf of those people. And God, because Moses and God have this one-of-a-kind, unique in all of history relationship, and God withheld his wrath. However, Moses, once he got back down to the camp, he took the golden calf, he melted it down, ground it into powder, and made the Israelites drink it. Then he had the Levites execute some 3,000 people. That's recorded in Exodus 32. And the Lord struck the people with a plague, it says in verse 35 of chapter 32, because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. So they didn't just get off scot-free. God was ticked, and there was a price to be paid, and there was a penalty to be carried out. And the covenant, before the ink is even dry, so to speak, is damaged. Now, God hasn't quit, and the Israelites are still his chosen people, but it is not going to be the way it could have been if they had just kept the covenant, if they had not grown impatient, if they had not tried to outthink God, and if they had just obeyed the things that Moses had already told them. Boy, there's lessons there for all of us, aren't there? And then the balance of the book, Exodus 33 through 40, is all about the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and the priestly garments, because they'd been given the instructions that God gave them. And then in great detail, the remainder of the book describes how the nation of Israel very carefully fulfilled all of the instructions. They followed them to the letter that God had given them. And God gave Moses a new set of stone tablets and reestablished this broken covenant. Now, as I said, from that point forward, it's never going to be the same. It's never going to be. Do you know the nation of Israel never possessed the Holy Land? They never possessed the Promised Land. Never fully. They never got it. Even today, there is a nation of Israel, and it's in turmoil. And it traces all the way back to that calf. That's where it started for them. That's where the covenant was damaged. If not broken, it was sure dinged up a bit. And so they built the tabernacle, they built the furnishings, the Ark of the Covenant, the priestly garments, all that stuff they did according to God's instructions. Now, I want to add one thing that is not recorded in the book of Exodus. A lot of people think that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness because of the golden calf. That's not why. Some of you know why. I'm not asking you to answer it now. If you've got a good Sunday school background, you know what it is. The golden calf was not why they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That is still to come, and you'll pick up on that in some of your future reading. Okay, for next week, I want you to read the book of Leviticus. A word about the book of Leviticus. Don't get discouraged by that. It's a lot of legal stuff. It's the the laws and all of that. Go ahead and wade through it. It'll make sense, and it all ties together. So stay with it. Folks, I love all of you. It's been good. I hope it's been a blessing to you, and I hope to see all of you who are in town on Sunday. God bless you. Good night.